I hadn't planned to stay long when I knocked on Laura Brooks's door that evening. It was raining lightly, the kind of rain that softened the world without truly washing anything away, and I was holding a misdelivered package with my name crossed out and hers written beneath it. A small, forgettable errand, at least that's what I told myself. When the door opened, however, it wasn't Laura who greeted me. It was her son. Daniel Brooks stood a few steps back from the doorway, barefoot on the wooden floor, a book resting loosely in his hand. The house behind him felt unusually quiet, as if it were holding its breath. He looked up, startled but polite, his expression settling into something reserved and careful. "Hi," he said. "My mom isn't home yet." "That's okay," I replied, lifting the package slightly. "I think this belongs to her." He nodded and stepped aside to let me in, the gesture hesitant but courteous. As I crossed the threshold, I noticed how empty the house felt, not abandoned, just paused. A lamp glowed softly in the corner of the living room, casting long shadows across the walls. Daniel placed the package on the table and then stood there, uncertain, like someone waiting for instructions that never came. "I'm Ethan," I said, mostly to fill the silence. "I know," he answered. "You live next door." That simple statement caught me off guard. I smiled, though it felt strained, and nodded. The truth was, I'd lived next door to the Brooks family for nearly 3 years, yet I couldn't remember the last time I'd exchanged more than a greeting with any of them. Familiarity without connection had become a pattern in my life. Daniel returned to the couch and sat down, curling one leg beneath him. He didn't turn on the television or reach for his phone. He just sat there, staring at nothing in particular. I should have left. That was the polite thing to do. But something about the way he sat, contained, solitary, made me linger. "Waiting for your mom?" I asked. "Yeah," he said. "She works late on Thursdays." I nodded again, as if I understood something important. The rain tapped gently against the windows, and the silence stretched, not uncomfortable but weighted. I realized, suddenly and uncomfortably, how familiar that silence felt. At home, silence had become my constant companion. Melissa and I shared a house, a schedule, and a history, but very little else. Our conversations were efficient, trimmed of emotion, focused on errands and obligations. We didn't argue, we simply drifted. Somewhere along the way, we'd learned how to avoid each other without ever admitting we were doing it. I told myself that was what stability looked like. Still, there were nights when I sat at the kitchen table long after dinner, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, wondering how something so quiet could feel so heavy. "You don't have to stay," Daniel said, his voice gentle, almost apologetic. "I know," I replied. "I don't mind for a minute." He glanced at me then, really looked at me, as if measuring the truth of my words. There was an openness in his expression that surprised me, unguarded, but not naive. He nodded once and returned his gaze to the window. "I like the rain," he said after a moment. "It makes things feel slower." I smiled. "Yeah. Like the world's giving you permission to pause." He considered that, his mouth lifting slightly at the corner. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was close. That small reaction felt strangely significant, like I'd crossed an invisible line without meaning to. We talked after that, cautiously at first. Daniel told me he was finishing college online, that he'd moved back home to help his mother after his father passed away a few years earlier. He spoke without drama, but there was an undercurrent of loss in his words, something unresolved. I listened more than I spoke, which was unusual for me. With Melissa, I often filled the silence out of habit, afraid that if I didn't, there would be nothing left between us at all. "What about you?" Daniel asked eventually. "Do you like living here?" The question was simple, but it landed harder than I expected. I thought of my house next door, the carefully chosen furniture, the framed photos that documented a happiness I no longer recognized. I thought of Melissa's back turned toward me in bed, the space between us widening by the night. "It's quiet," I said finally. Daniel nodded, as if that answer made perfect sense. "Quiet can be good," he said. "Or it can be lonely." The honesty in his voice startled me. I felt a flicker of something sharp and unfamiliar in my chest, followed quickly by guilt. This was Laura's son. He was younger than me by more than a decade. I had no business reading into his words, no right to feel seen by them. Still, the feeling lingered, refusing to be dismissed. When headlights swept across the front window, Daniel stood. "That's her," he said. Relief and disappointment collided inside me as Laura's key turned in the lock. She greeted me warmly, thanked me for bringing the package, and apologized for not being home sooner. The moment shifted, reshaped by her presence. Whatever fragile space had existed between Daniel and me folded in on itself, becoming something ordinary again. As I stepped back out into the rain, Laura calling out a friendly goodbye, I felt unsettled. The night air was cool against my skin, grounding me, but my thoughts were anything but calm. I told myself it had been nothing, a brief conversation, a shared quiet. Yet as I walked back to my own front door, I realized I was already replaying Daniel's words in my mind, the way he'd looked at me when he said lonely. Inside my house, the lights were off. Melissa hadn't come home yet. I stood there for a moment, listening to the rain, and wondered why a simple visit next door felt like the first crack in a wall I'd been pretending didn't exist. I tried to convince myself that the restlessness I felt the next morning had nothing to do with Daniel Brooks. I blamed poor sleep, the rain that hadn't quite stopped, the quiet tension that had settled into my marriage like permanent fog. Still, as I stood at the kitchen counter sipping coffee, my gaze drifted toward the window that faced the Brooks house more often than it should have. Melissa moved around behind me, efficient and distant. She kissed my cheek out of habit, not warmth, and reminded me about a dinner she wouldn't be home for that night. I nodded, grateful and ashamed at the same time. When the door closed behind her, the silence rushed back in, familiar and suffocating. That I didn't plan to see Daniel again so soon. At least, that's what I told myself when I stepped outside later that afternoon under the pretense of checking the mailbox. He was sitting on the front steps of his house, a mug cradled between his hands, staring out at the wet street. The sight of him sent a quiet jolt through me, equal parts recognition and caution. "Hey," he said, standing when he noticed me. "Hey," I replied, slowing my steps. "Waiting for the rain to stop." Something like that. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, the air between us charged with the memory of the night before. I was aware of every sensible reason to keep walking, to wave politely and return home. Instead, I found myself asking, "Mind if I join you for a minute?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "No. That's fine." We sat on the steps, a careful distance between us. The street was quiet, the neighborhood wrapped in the dull calm that followed a storm. Daniel took a sip from his mug and sighed softly, as if releasing something he'd been holding in. "My mom worries when I'm alone too much," he said, not looking at me. "But she's always busy." "I don't blame her." "You don't sound angry," I observed. "I was, once," he admitted. "It just got tiring." His words lingered, heavy with meaning. I recognized that fatigue, the exhaustion that came from carrying disappointment without knowing where to put it. I wanted to tell him that, wanted to bridge the gap with shared understanding, but I stopped myself. Wanting, I realized, could be dangerous. Instead, I said, "It's not easy, being the one who adjusts." He glanced at me then, his eyes searching. "You sound like you know that feeling." I should have deflected. I should have laughed it off. Instead, I nodded. "Yeah. I do." That was how it began, not with a dramatic confession, but with small truths exchanged carefully, like fragile objects. Over the next few days, our paths crossed more often. Sometimes it was accidental, sometimes less so. A brief conversation by the fence turned into longer talks on the porch. We spoke about ordinary things at first, books, music, the strange comfort of routines, but gradually, the conversation deepened. Daniel spoke about the isolation he felt living in a house full of memories, about friends who had moved on while he stayed behind. I listened, offering nothing but attention, and was startled by how much that seemed to matter to him. In return, I found myself sharing pieces of my own life I'd long kept hidden. Not complaints about Melissa, not accusations, just admissions of distance, of feeling unseen. Each conversation left me unsettled. I'd walk back into my house with Daniel's words echoing in my head, only to be met by the quiet absence of my wife. The contrast sharpened something inside me, a realization I wasn't ready to name. One evening, as dusk settled and the sky turned a muted gray, Daniel asked quietly, "Are you happy, Ethan?" The question caught me off guard. It wasn't invasive, just honest. I thought of Melissa's polite smiles, of the way we moved around each other like strangers sharing a space. I thought of the ease I felt sitting on these steps, talking to someone who listened. "I don't know," I said. "I think I've been telling myself I am for a long time." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the street. "Sometimes that's easier." The intimacy of that moment frightened me. There was no touch, no explicit boundary crossed, yet I felt the weight of it pressing against my chest. I was aware, painfully so, of the line I was approaching. Every instinct told me to pull back, to re-establish distance. And yet, I stayed. When I finally stood to leave, the air felt heavier than before. "I should go," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Okay," Daniel replied. There was something in his tone, understanding, perhaps, or disappointment, that followed me all the way home. That night, lying beside Melissa as she slept, I stared at the ceiling and felt the full measure of my guilt. Nothing had happened, I told myself. Nothing physical, nothing obvious. Yet I couldn't deny the truth forming quietly in my mind. I was beginning to look forward to moments that didn't belong to my marriage. The realization didn't come with excitement. It came with fear. Did I end the days that followed? I tried to distance myself. I avoided lingering outside, cut conversations short. Daniel noticed, of course. The confusion in his eyes mirrored my own internal conflict. When he finally asked, "Did I do something wrong?" I felt a sharp pang of regret. "No," I said quickly. "This is complicated." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded. "I get that." But even as we stepped back into safer territory, I knew something had shifted. The silence between us was no longer empty, it was charged with everything we weren't saying. As I walked away, the sense that I was standing at the edge of a choice, one that could change everything, settled heavily over me, refusing to be ignored.